Hello, I'm going to make this clean and to the point. I'm going to read this. I'm sorry if you don't want to look at my face, you can look away. And I hope that I will make some sense here. Anyway, this is essentially something that I wrote in 2004 for an opportunity to address the plenary session of the Citizens' Assembly, which of course I was denied, but this is what I presented by way of evidence. My name is John Allen West. I am 68 years young. Well, I'm now 73 years young. I'm a lover of wisdom and a servant of God. And by the way, I probably hadn't properly defined the word God at that time for the general understanding. I believe God is the grand order divine, and the personality of Godhead, of course, depends on the cultural and religious tradition from which you come. And of course, if you are, like myself, both mystical and metaphysical in your ruminations about the nature of God and about the nature of creation, then we make the distinguish between what is clearly creation, which we're all very much a part, and the grand order divine, which transcends all of our science and all of our minds, that we accept as the grand order divine. And to amplify that is still the work of science and philosophers. So I would call that metaphysics. Anyway, back to the piece here. I have 9 grandchildren, I only had 5 then, and a rather determined set of ethical values. I immigrated to Canada from England after service in the RAF and BBC in the fall of 1959. From spring 1960 until spring 1965, I worked at CBC Vancouver as a technician. From 65 to 72, I freelanced occasionally as a film director for documentary inserts into such shows as Hourglass and The 7 O'Clock Show, locally produced documentary shows which probably are no longer the case. Having spent the second 5 years of my life on the fringe of a war zone on the south coast of England, and seeing the clumsiness of empire at the time of the Suez Crisis while I was in the Air Force, I had a keen interest in public affairs, which were directed towards freedom, justice, and world peace. It was partly as a result of Lester Pearson's leadership at the United Nations, which voted me to vote with my feet for my own country and to come to Canada's decision, which, by the way, I've never regretted, in spite of the lack of integrity, intelligence, or even common sense demonstrated by subsequent administrations of every political partisan stripe. And in that, I guess I'm in common with most Canadians of my age and experience. When I discovered about 20 years ago I had been disenfranchised on the very reasonable grounds, I thought at that time, that I had not become a Canadian citizen. One should remember that in those days British landed immigrants were allowed to vote. I took it as a sign that I should stand aside from the political system entirely, which by that time I had established pretty corrupted by social trickery. I should stand aside from political system entirely and use my biocomputer mind to evolve the process by which individual and collective enlightenment and well-being might be achieved. When I came to Canada at 23, I had a few chips on my shoulder. One is that no matter where or to what nation or station in life we are born, we are all children of the same creative force, that is, equal and different, and therefore deserving of human rights and respect. Having grown up a commoner in the middle of the technical middle classes, I guess that attitude is hardly a surprise, and I believe it is the foundation of our common humanity. More surprising is that as a result of hearing my grandfather hold forth on the injustice and genocide of First Nations, I have held out and still hold out firmly for honourable settlement. In the fall of 72, as a result of my then ambitious desire to make a public service career in media, I recorded an on-camera piece, I guess we call them op-eds then, for Viewpoint, which was a popular national television personal opinions show which followed the late national news on CBC, and I think that went on in those days at 9 o'clock. It seemed without being fully conscious of what I was doing, I threw the cat in with the pigeons. Well, career-wise, to use that odious style, it was downhill and out all the way for yours truly. All the boys and girls in the studio, however, clapped and cheered when I finished reading the 4-minute piece. A very rare event, I might say. I never saw it previously, but anyway, they liked what I said. Very gratifying, and not much help in finding another job, however. What I came to realize later was that in those 4 minutes, as a simple common man addressing truths about the inherent dangers of adversarial partisan politics, I had touched a critical number of kind hearts of free-thinking Canadians. The difficulty was that what I had observed and commented on exposed the greatest weakness in democratic governance: cabinet dictatorship. This is much more widely understood today than 30 years earlier, and with the experiences of this moment, that's clearly evident. Having somewhat inadvertently let the cat out of the bag, and having excellent feedback from a fairly wide community of thinking Canadians, I have to admit that I may have gone a little over the top. I prepared a brief which I delivered to Ottawa to the Governor-General, Roland Michener at that time, in which I pointed out that the warrant for money to underwrite the unemployment insurance, which the Prime Minister, Mr. P.E. Trudeau, had called for, should not be granted until Parliament was in session and that the party in power had a clear mandate to do so. This was not the case at the time. By the way, that really challenged the whole fiscal situation with the Governor-General. I never did get an answer from Government House, but history shows that the Westminster system has failed in Canada to protect the common sovereignty of the Canadian people from a dictatorship of the Prime Minister's office, and that the House of Commons is little more than an ill-mannered shouting match or an empty, well-appointed shell for lonely, well-meaning, equally redundant oration. I left the brief with the RCMP and the British High Commissioner and washed my hands of the whole mess of public affairs. I went back to my little farm in Terranova, Richmond, and driving a cab to pay the mortgage. That was also about the time I became aware of the fact there had been no treaty in British Columbia with First Nations, and that I could not ethically own land or willingly pay taxes. Raise a public voice about that, as I did, for too long, and it wasn't very long, and the police are at the door. Access to polite company is curtailed. Social marginalisation. And then, pretty soon, the immigration man is looking up your address, etc. Fortunately, I had a Canadian wife and 2 Canadian children, and I was obviously pretty harmless, and they let me stay. Life moved on, and so did my wife and children. I sold the farm to settle accounts and decided to drop out and contemplate the nature of my soul, a journey which occupies me to this day. I was radicalized by American draft dodgers, turned on to marijuana by symphony musicians and university professors, jailed by drunken judges, shouted down by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and called a creep by a Prime Minister, all because I stood for some truth. A lot of the above, I hope, helps to explain why I took it on 10 years ago, now, 16 years ago, 15, 16, as a personal mission to effect changes in the electoral process for the purpose of individual and collective enlightenment. Documentary evidence of this is available at my website, www.rainbowcoalition.ca.